Pas de soleil, 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 pas de soleil.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Adulting with Hannah. I'm Hannah, back today with another installment of my zodiac, murder, astrology, serial killer series that I'm still working on a name for. This is installment number 7, I think. You'd think I would have figured out a name by now. Not true. And my battery is dying and it's been 2 minutes. Great, excellent, awesome. Anyways, so today we are continuing on with my murder astrology videos, talking about all of the serial killers who are Pisces. I tried to do this during Pisces season. It's July, so we did our best. Today we're going to be talking about 40 Pisces serial killers, brief synopsises of all of them. There's a couple that I found really interesting that I went a little bit more in depth on. Without further ado, Pisces serial killer number 1, Mikhail Popkov. Mikhail is from Russia. He was born March 7th, 1964. He assaulted and murdered nearly 80 women between 1992 and 2010, so he was active for a very long time. He was actually convicted of 78 murders, but he actually confessed to 83. His reasoning for killing women was because he suspected that his wife was cheating on him, so that's just like a really good reason. Every single one of his victims were between the ages of 16 and 40, so a pretty wide age range. He was actually a police officer in Russia at one time and would use his authority to lure women into dangerous situations, and he is actually Russia's most prolific known serial killer. He was actually sentenced to life in prison in 2015, and he is currently 58 years old. Next up, we have a big one that I think a lot of people will recognize. John Wayne Gacy is a Pisces. He was born March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He was convicted of 33 murders of young men and boys. Most of them he actually buried in the crawl space under his home in one of the suburbs of Chicago, which has since been demolished, so don't try to go find it, you weirdos. His MO was to lure men into his home. A lot of the time it was under the guise of hiring them for his construction company. He would trick them into handcuffing themselves by claiming it was a magic trick. He typically sexually assaulted these men and even tortured them, and his main means of murder was strangulation. Eventually he literally filled his crawl space with dead bodies and started dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. He is known as the killer clown because of his desire to dress up like a clown called Pogo, which is just... Anyways, he was sentenced to death for his crimes and was executed by lethal injection in 1994 at the age of 52. Next, we have Charles Edmund Cullen. He was born February 22nd, 1960 in New Jersey. He was actually a nurse for 16 years and confessed to killing 40 of his patients during that time, but some people who kind of went back through hospital records actually think it was like a lot more than that. They actually think he was responsible for over 400 deaths in the hospital, which is insane. So if that is true, that would make him the most prolific serial killer ever. But like I said, he only confessed to 40, and that's what we know about for sure. However, only 29 were ever actually confirmed out of those estimated 400. So his MO was pretty typical of nurses or people in like a medical care position who kill people, was just to give them a lethal dose of like insulin or morphine and things like that, and he did it a lot. He was sentenced to 18 life sentences in 2003, and he's currently still serving those life sentences in New Jersey, and he is 62. I'm really nervous to try to say this name. Yevgeny Chaplinsky. He was born March 14th, 1965 in Russia. He murdered sex workers, and he's convicted of murdering 19 of them in Russia. He had some pretty ritualistic murders. He would typically mutilate the body. He would use pentagrams, carve things into their skin, lots of rituals involved. Nobody's really sure if he was actually like doing a ritual or if he was just trying to throw law enforcement off and make them think it was like a cult or something. Nobody really knows for sure. In 2017, they did like some psych evals to determine if he was sane enough to stand trial because of all these like ritualistic tendencies. After he was declared sane, they charged him with 19 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He's still currently serving his life sentence, and he is 57. We have another Russian, lots of Russian Pisces, Alexander Spesivtev. He was born March 1st, 1970 in Russia, and he is known as the Siberian Ripper. So he actually had a partner in his crimes, and that partner was his mom. And him and his mom would target typically children or women living on the streets. They would lure them in to their apartment like as a place to stay. They would then torture and murder their victims, and sometimes they would eat them. At a young age, Alexander's mom would show him like pictures of dead bodies and like really morbid stuff. His first victim was murdered when he was only 18, and it was actually his girlfriend, and he killed her because she broke up with him. He kidnapped and tortured her in his apartment, and it took her a month to die of sepsis. He was only convicted of 4 murders, but he confessed to 19. Some experts estimate there was like more like 80, but again, he was only convicted of 4 of them. He eventually was sent to a psychiatric hospital in 1996. His mother received only 13 years in prison for her crimes, so Alexander is still in a psychiatric hospital, and he is 52. Next, we have Pedro Pablo Nakada Ludena, born February 28th, 1973 in Peru. He was convicted of 17 murders, but he confessed to 25. His MO was typically shooting his victims with a 9mm pistol. He actually fabricated his own silencer using slippers somehow, so that's pretty crafty. He claimed that God was commanding him to cleanse the world of sex workers and drug addicts, so that was his reasoning for killing people. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison in 2006, and that was actually a maximum sentence in Peru at the time. So he is eligible for release in 2041, and he is currently 49 years old. Next, we have Randy Stephen Kraft. He was born March 19th, 1945 in Long Beach, California. He sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 16 young men from 1972 to 1983, but he is suspected to be involved in 51 more than that. Investigators among his belongings when he was arrested found like a list in code of like 61 entries on a scorecard, and it was like cryptic messages about like his victims and like details about the crimes. His MO was typically to lure men into his car. He would offer them like alcohol, drugs. Then he would somehow bind them and then would torture them, sexually assault them, and ultimately typically bludgeon or strangle them to death. He typically would discard his victims along freeways in California. He is currently on death row in San Quentin and is 77 years old. Okay, next we have another big one. This is Richard Ramirez. He is also a Pisces. He is also known as the Night Stalker. There's been a lot of documentaries about him lately, so I won't go into tons of detail about it. He was born February 29th, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. Again, he's known as the Night Stalker. He is a serial killer, serial rapist, kidnapper, child molester, and burglar. Very long rap sheet. His crimes took place in a very short period of time in California from June 1984 to August 1985. He was on a rampage. He was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, 14 counts of burglary, and sentenced to 19 death sentences. He ended up actually dying from complications of lymphoma in 2013 at age 53, and he only spent 23 years on death row. Next, we have Donald Henry Gaskins, another 3-namer. Born March 13th, 1933 in South Carolina. He stabbed, shot, drowned, and poisoned over a dozen people. He was arrested in relation to delinquency with a minor who was 13, and police found 8 bodies buried near his home. He was sentenced to death by electric chair in 1976, which was carried out in 1991 when he was 58. Next, we have Francis Hume. He was born February 25th in France. I didn't write down a year. Francis was abused by his father until he was 17. He had untreated Klinefelters, which is when a male has an extra X chromosome, which is the female chromosome. So it's like instead of XY, he has XXY. So that would typically give you like small testicles and like other features that are more like feminine, maybe like hard to grow body hair, like things like that. He was kind of made fun of at school for that, and he murdered 9 or more people, but it's estimated that he raped and murdered dozens of people. He was convicted to life in prison with no chance of parole for 22 years. That was in 1997. Then in 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole once more evidence of more murders started surfacing, probably due to DNA evidence at that time. So he is currently still in prison, and he is 63. Next, we have another big one, Dennis Rader. He is better known as BTK. Such a douchebag. He was born March 9th, 1945 in Kansas. He is known as BTK, like I said, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill, which is actually a moniker he gave himself, which, like, I don't know, when like murderers and serial killers give themselves their own moniker, that's just like so lame. So he killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991 in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. And during that time, he would typically send taunting letters to police. He took a really long hiatus after the 1991 murder and started killing again in 2004. And this time, technology kind of aided in his capture. He ended up being caught by like sending a floppy disk to the police as one of his letters or whatever, and it like had his name on it attached to like the church that he worked for. There's lots of documentaries about this guy. I'm not going to go too into it. His victims ranged in age from 9 to 62. He's currently serving his life sentence in El Dorado, Kansas, and he is 77. Robert Joseph Silvera Jr. is our next one. He was born March 3rd, 1959 in California. He committed crimes across 7 different states, and his MO was typically to ride trains around the US and kill other train riders. He killed anywhere from 9 to maybe 30 people, confessed to 28 of them, and he's currently serving a life sentence in Wyoming, and he is 63. Eric Edgar Cook. He was born February 25th, 1931 in Australia. His MO was all over the place. Like, he didn't have any one method of killing people. It made it really hard to capture him. He did hit and runs, he would stab people, he would strangle people, he would shoot people. It was all over the place. Eventually he was arrested, claimed that he had schizophrenia, but after psychological evaluation that was considered false. He was executed in 1964 by hanging, and he was only 33 years old. Next we have another Australian. His name is Christopher Wilder. He was born March 13th, 1945. He abducted and raped at least 12 young women, and he killed 8 of them during a 6 weeks crime spree in the United States in 1984. There's been many unsolved murders since his death that he's been a suspect for. He died in a police struggle in 1984 at age 39, and this happened before he was ever able to go to trial. Todd Kohlhepp. He was born March 7th, 1971 in Florida. He is a serial killer and sex offender, convicted of 7 counts of murder and 3 counts of kidnapping, which took place between 2003 and 2016. As a child, he was always very aggressive towards other children, and he displayed cruelty to animals. He was sentenced to life without parole and is currently incarcerated in South Carolina. He is currently 51. Next, we have Satoru Fukage. He was born in February 1889 in Japan. He killed at least 7 girls from 1906 to 1924, and he is known to have raped 93 girls and nearly 100 women. So that's almost 200 people. He was sentenced to death in 1925 and then hanged in 1926 at age 37. It's horrific. Stanislaw Madzaluski. He was born March 15th, 1929 in Poland. He was convicted of 7 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. His MO was typically to target women ages 8 to 87, so literally anyone. He would strangle them with typically either a scarf or his bare hands. His murders were typically sexual in nature, and his bodies were found nude from the waist down, and he would typically have sexually assaulted them. And he was sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out in 1969 when he was 40. Peter Manuel. He was born March 13th, 1927 in New York City. He was convicted of 7 murders which took place in Scotland from 1956 to 1958. He was born to Scottish parents in New York City, but they migrated back to Scotland in 1932. His victims were women aged 17 to 45. They were typically shot or bludgeoned to death after they were sexually assaulted by Manuel. He was caught after using stolen banknotes from one of the families that he murdered. He murdered the Smarts family in Scotland and then stole money from them, and the stolen banknotes were traced back to him, ultimately leading to his capture. He was hanged in Scotland in 1958 at age 51, the same year that he killed the Smarts family, so they are very on top of their due process. Next we have Christine Falling. She was born Christine Slaughter March 12th, 1963 in Florida. So when she was born, her mom was 16 and her father was 65. And the family lived in poverty most of her life. Eventually, they put Christine in an orphanage for a period of time during her childhood when her parents couldn't take care of her anymore. She started killing small animals at a very young age. She liked to kill cats to test to see if they actually had 9 lives. When she was 14, her parents forced her to marry a 20-year-old man named, I'm not kidding, his name was Goober Falling. Goober. So Christine was forced to marry Goober when she was 14, but their marriage only lasted 6 weeks, so I can't even imagine. So over the next 2 years, she would start having hypochondriac episodes and was hospitalized 50 times. At age 16, she began babysitting for neighbors to earn money. So in February of 1980, Christine was babysitting a 2-year-old named Cassidy. Cassidy was sent to the doctor and then diagnosed with encephalitis, which is like brain swelling. She died 3 days later, and an autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head. When the police asked Christine what happened, she said that Cassidy had fallen out of her crib. So the physician, and I don't know if this is the one that did the autopsy or the physician that helped Cassidy like when she was sent to the hospital before she died, but he was very suspicious about the circumstances. So he sent a note over to the police to see if they could investigate further. However, the note was lost, so the police never followed up at this point. 2 months later, April 1980, Christine moved to a different city in Florida, and she was babysitting a 4-year-old named Jeffrey, and he died while she was babysitting him. The autopsy concluded that he had myocarditis, which is a heart condition that's rarely ever fatal, but for whatever reason, that's what they decided was the cause of death. During Jeffrey's funeral, this same little boy's funeral, they had Christine babysitting his 2-year-old cousin Joseph. And while she was babysitting him, he died as well. And doctors ruled it as a viral infection, which they decided was also probably the cause for Jeffrey's death as well. A little too many coincidences in my opinion. So July 1981, almost over a year later, she moved back to her original hometown in Florida, and nobody wanted her to babysit their kids, obviously. So she started doing home care for seniors to earn money. One day, Christine was taking care of 77-year-old William, who died in his kitchen. In the fall of 1981, Christine was left in the car with her half-sister's 8-month-old child while her half-sister ran into the store. When the half-sister came back to the car, Jennifer had stopped breathing, the 8-month-old, and the doctors ruled it as a case of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. So about 6 months later, July 1982, 10-week-old Travis died while Christine was taking care of him. Doctors found internal injuries caused by suffocation in the autopsy. So this is when police finally started investigating Christine. She confessed to murdering 3 of the 6 victims because somebody in her head was telling her to kill babies. So she was sentenced to life in prison in 1982. She became eligible for parole in 2017. At that point, she was given 7 more years. So it sounds like she'll be eligible for parole again in 2024. She is currently serving her time in Florida, and she is 59. Next, we have Doug Clark, part of the Sunset Strip Killers. He was born March 10th, 1948 in Pennsylvania. Him and his girlfriend Carol Bundy, who we talked about in the Virgo serial killers video, they would ultimately have 6 victims. They would carry out like sexual and pedophilic fantasies together. If you want to learn more about it, listen to the Virgo video. I think I covered it a little more in depth. But he was convicted of killing 6 victims, like I said. He is currently on death row in California, and he is 74. Otis Toole was born March 5th, 1947 in Florida. He is convicted of killing 6 people from 1961 to 1983, but he actually confessed to hundreds more crimes. So he would kill a lot of his victims with his partner Henry Lee Lucas, who is also known as the Confession Killer. There was actually a very interesting documentary about him on Netflix, I believe, and I think it was called The Confession Killer. So Otis confessed to a lot of murders as well, and there was one very high profile one, and that was the murder of Adam Walsh. Adam was 6 years old when he was abducted and murdered, and his dad, John Walsh is now the host of America's Most Wanted. There are still people who are pretty skeptical that Otis Toole was involved in Adam's death. John Walsh and the Florida police did eventually name Otis Toole as the killer and then eventually closed the case. So Otis was sentenced to life in prison in 1984, and he died of cirrhosis in 1996 when he was 49. Morris Solomon was born March 15th, 1944 in Georgia. He was convicted of murdering 6 women aged 17 to 29 from July 1986 to April 1987. He was mentally and physically abused as a child, and there's actually a documentary about his crimes on the Discovery Channel on the show Crime Stories. He's currently on death row in California and is 78 years old. We have another high profile one here, Eileen Wuornos. She was born February 29th, 1956 in Michigan. So she was a prostitute in Florida when she committed her crimes. She would typically pick up people on the highways in Florida. She robbed and murdered 7 of her male clients, claiming that they had tried to sexually assault her. According to specialists, she has psychopathic personality, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. Some of her interviews have been made pretty famous because of her demeanor, so I'll put in a couple of clips here if I can find those.
I'm just wondering how you're going to be, at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Are you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right. I'm all right with it.
And how...
I'm all right with it, but like I said, remember, let them know that I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up and let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
Nonetheless,
Yeah?
you killed 7 men.
Yes, you
And
did.
I'm asking you, what got you to kill the 7
And
men?
I'm telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't you get it?
Not everybody is killing 7 people. So there must have been something in you that was getting you to
Oh,
do
you
that.
are lost, Nick.
So
I was a
explain-
hitchhiking hooker.
Right.
Running into trouble. I shoot the guy if I ran into trouble.
So she was sentenced to death for 6 murders in 1992 and was executed by lethal injection in 2002 when she was 46. So if anybody has seen the film Monster starring Charlize Theron, that is a biographical film about Eileen Wuornos. I've actually never seen it, so let me know if I should watch it. I believe she won a pretty big award for that. Next we have Ladislav Hoyer. He was born March 15th, 1958 in Czechoslovakia. He's a rapist, serial killer, and cannibal. He murdered 5 women aged 18 to 51 between 1978 and 1981 in Czechoslovakia. He was psychologically analyzed after his arrest, and they found him to be a primitive psychopath, which is a term I'm not super familiar with. I mean, I can make assumptions about it. Doctors say he has an amoral anabolic personality with schizoid features and aggressive tendencies. I've never heard the amoral anabolic personality. I don't know if this is a Czechoslovakian thing, but it's just not terms that I'm familiar with, but also a very interesting analysis. So he was motivated typically by previous negative experiences with women. We're all shocked about it. He was sentenced to death in 1982 and was executed in 1986 when he was 28, which is my age. Yikes. Next we have Stephen Richards. He was born March 18th, 1856 in West Virginia. He confessed to killing 9 people from 1876 to 1878. He also murdered Mary Harrelson and her family, which included her 10, 4, and 2-year-old children. He was actually dating her at the time, or had just started dating her, and then murdered her and her children. So he was very charismatic, and overall the descriptions of his behavior and his demeanor reminded forensic psychologists of Ted Bundy. He was sentenced to death in 1879 and was executed by hanging in 1879 when he was 23. Next we have Kathy Wood. She was born March 7th, 1962 in Washington State. She's part of the serial killing duo with Gwendolyn Graham. They together killed 5 elderly women in the Grand Rapids area in 1987. They were nurses' aides and committed these murders together while they were working in a nursing home. Their motive for murdering their elderly patients was to prove some sort of love bond to each other. Their MO was typically to smother their patients, who were all aged 65 to 97. Most of them suffered from Alzheimer's, and so their deaths weren't ever really thoroughly investigated because it just was chalked up to being the natural effects of Alzheimer's. Eventually, they started turning their murders into a game. They were trying to select patients whose names would spell out the word murder. Eventually, they like switched to another phrase or something like that. I don't know. So they eventually got caught because Kathy Wood told her ex-husband about them committing murders, and he told the police. So good job, ex-husband. So during the trial, Kathy Wood claimed that Gwendolyn Graham was the one that was behind all the murders, and that she actually carried out the murders so that Kathy could get a reduced sentence. Kathy Wood was charged with 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to murder, and she was sentenced to 20 years on each count, so 40 years total. They've been mentioned in the media a lot since then because this is kind of an interesting like dynamic, like serial killing female duo isn't super common. So this was the basis of a book called Forever in 5 Days by Lowell Cauffiel. They were also featured in 2 episodes of the show Serial Killers. They were featured in an episode of Snapped Killer Couples, and the American Horror Story show 6th season Roanoke featured fictionalized versions of Kathy and Gwendolyn. They were played as the characters Miranda and Bridget Jane, who in the show were sisters. So those characters were based on Gwendolyn and Kathy. So Kathy was actually released from prison in January of 2020, and she is 60 years old. Kind of funny that she gets out of prison and then surprise, it's COVID. Next we have Colin Ireland. He was born March 16th in Kent, England. I believe this is our first British Pisces. Isn't that weird? He murdered 5 homosexual men in the United Kingdom from March to June of 1993. He claimed that he was not a homosexual. He claimed to be heterosexual, and he only pretended to be gay to lure in his victims. So he just wanted to kill gay people because he didn't like gay people, I guess. But he also claimed that the murders were not sexually motivated. He was a very organized killer. He would carry around a murder kit. He would clean up the crime scene. He was eventually sentenced to death and executed in 1994 at age 32. Farion Wardrip was born March 6th, 1959 in Indiana. He is a rapist and serial killer who murdered 5 women in Texas in 1984. His victims were all white women between the ages of 20 and 25, and they all weighed less than 120 pounds and were under 5'5". That is like the most specific victim profile I have ever heard in my life. So he definitely had a type. His final murder was Tina Kembrough. Her murder resulted in his arrest and sentence of 35 years in prison, but he was paroled after 11 years. Then they had DNA evidence, so they were able to tie him to his first murder, which was Terry Sims, and then that linked him to the other ones as well. So then after he was paroled, he was sent back to prison in 1999. He is currently on death row in Texas, and he is 63. Next we have Stephen Akinmurel. He was born March 16th, 1978 in Nigeria. So he is actually British, but he was living in Nigeria, and he was convicted of murdering 5 elderly people from 1995 to 1998. He began committing crimes against elderly people really young, when he was only 11. He confessed to some of the murders, but then he unalived himself at age 21 before he could go to trial. He did leave behind a letter, and he confessed to the murders and apologized to his mom. He said that he would probably kill again. And then he actually in his letter admitted to killing 3 younger people, but the police weren't able to determine if that was true, couldn't find any evidence about that, and they're thinking that it was just to make it seem like he wasn't obsessed with only killing old people. Joseph Edward Duncan, he was born February 25th, 1963 in North Carolina. He is a convicted serial killer, kidnapper, child molester, and rapist. His rap sheet is very long. He started committing crimes when he was 15. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for sexually assaulting a boy in Tacoma, Washington when he was a teenager. So he spent a lot of his adult life in prison. Ultimately, he's estimated to have killed 8 people, raped 16, molested 7, and stalked 3. The most publicized of his crimes was the murder and kidnapping of the Groan family. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Groan? Shasta Groan was 8 years old when Joseph Duncan murdered her mother, Brenda, and her fiance, Mark. Their son, Slade, was 13 and he was murdered as well. Shasta and her 9-year-old brother were kidnapped by Duncan, and they were molested and tortured for 6 weeks after their kidnapping. Eventually, Duncan shot Shasta's brother Dylan and then threatened to kill Shasta over the next few days. Somehow Shasta was able to convince Duncan not to murder her, and she was actually rescued at a Denny's restaurant where somebody recognized her when she was out to dinner with Duncan himself. She was reunited with her father because it was her mom's fiance who was murdered originally, so her father was still alive and they were reunited. Duncan was finally apprehended in 2005 and died at the age of 58 of brain cancer in 2020. William Patrick Fife. He was born February 27th, 1955 in Ontario, Canada. He is convicted of killing 5 women in Canada and claims to have killed an additional 4. Overall, his childhood was actually reported to be pretty normal. He was raised by his aunt. His MO was sexual assault and stabbing, and his victims were aged 46 to 59. He was apprehended in 1999, and DNA evidence tied him to the murder of his last victim, 50-year-old Mary Glenn. He was sentenced to life in prison and is currently 67 years old. Stephen John Port. He was born February 22nd, 1975 in Essex, England. He is convicted of murdering 4 men and several sexual assaults. Port would typically meet his victims online. He joined several different gay and bisexual-oriented hookup websites and apps. He would lie about his background. He would often tell them he was like a naval officer and stuff like that, but then he would drug his victims with GHB, and then he would sexual assault and murder them in his flat, and this took place between the years of 2014 and 2015. He at one point tried to convince authorities that one of his victims murdered one of his other victims by placing a suicide note next to his victim saying that that victim murdered another victim. Didn't work. Stephen Port's drug dealer, the one that gave him the GHB, he also drugged somebody with GHB and murdered them after meeting them on Grindr. So Stephen Port was sentenced to a whole life order or a life sentence in November of 2016. So he is currently serving out that sentence and he is 47. Next we have Leopold Dion. He was born February 25th in Quebec, Canada. He is a sex offender and serial killer who raped 21 boys and killed 4 of them from April to May of 1963. He would typically lure his victims, some of them as young as 8 or 10, and he would claim to be a photographer. So he was sentenced to death, which was commuted to life in prison in 1963. He was stabbed to death in prison in 1972 at age 52. And he absolutely deserved it. Next we have Peter Woodcock. He was also born in Canada on March 5th. He was diagnosed as a child rapist and psychopath and was charged with 4 murders. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sentenced to a psychiatric facility in 1957 where he was placed in an experimental treatment program there. That treatment obviously proved ineffective on psychopathy. He murdered a fellow patient on his first day of unsupervised release in 1991 after spending 34 years of the facility. So literally the one day they give him unsupervised release, he killed someone. So he died in 2010 on his 71st birthday of natural causes while in the psychiatric facility. John Straffen, he was born February 27th, 1930 in Hampshire, England. He is convicted of killing 2 girls in 1951 and was found unfit to stand trial. So he was also committed to a psychiatric facility called Broadmoor when he was 21. A year later, he did escape the hospital and killed again. This time he was sentenced to death, which was eventually commuted to a whole life order in prison. So he served 55 years of prison and died in 2007 at age 77. He actually died on my birthday. So he is actually the longest serving prisoner in British history because he was committed to the hospital so young. He was only 21. Fun fact. We have 2 more here. Next is Juan Covington. He was born March 3rd, 1962 in Pennsylvania. He is convicted of 3 murders and 5 neighborhood shootings from 1998 to 2005. He actually had a mental illness which would cause delusions, which was what led to a lot of his crimes. He is currently serving 3 life terms and is 60 years old. Robert Napper, he was born February 25th, 1966 in London, England. He is convicted of 2 murders, 1 count of manslaughter, 2 rapes, and 2 attempted rapes from 1992 to 1993. He has since been diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia and is on the autism spectrum. He was connected to his crimes by DNA evidence in 2004 when he was sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital, again a psychiatric hospital, and he's currently serving an indefinite detention. And he is 56 years old, so I guess that just means he might be released, he might not. Okay, that is all of the Pisces. I actually haven't selected the next zodiac sign to cover, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them below. I will put on the screen which ones I've already covered as of this video. I thank you so much for watching this video, and I'm really glad you stuck around to the end. I know it's a long one. I hope you enjoy this series. I have a morbid curiosity about serial killers, and obviously you do too. So there's more to come, and I hope you subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you know when I post new videos. I'll see you in my next one. Bye.